You don't lack intelligence, you lack honesty with your own thinking. That's the uncomfortable truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You tell yourself you understand things because you've seen them before, because they sound familiar, because someone explained them once and it felt convincing. But familiarity is not understanding. Recognition is not mastery. And the gap between the two is where your progress quietly dies. You live in that gap more often than you realize. You consume information, you nod along, you move on, and you never stop to ask the only question that matters. Do I truly understand this, or am I just comfortable with it? That question is dangerous because it forces you into uncertainty. It strips away the illusion of competence. It exposes how shallow your knowledge really is. And most people would rather protect their ego than face that reality. That's why they stay stuck. Real thinking demands honesty so brutal it feels offensive. It forces you to admit that you've been fooling yourself, sometimes for years. It forces you to slow down when everything around you is pushing speed. It forces you to sit in confusion instead of escaping it. And here's the part that hits hardest. The moment you stop lying to yourself about what you know is the moment real learning finally begins. Not before. Never before. You can read 10 books, watch 100 lectures, and still be completely lost if you never challenge your own understanding. The problem isn't lack of resources, it's lack of intellectual courage. You're not blocked by complexity. You're blocked by the habit of pretending complexity has already been conquered. That habit is subtle, automatic, and destructive. Break it and everything changes. Keep it and nothing ever will. Feynman didn't try to sound smart. That alone separates him from most people you encounter today. He didn't chase admiration, approval, or the illusion of intelligence. He chased understanding with a level of obsession that made everything else irrelevant. And that's where the gap begins to show. You've been trained, consciously or not, to value how you appear over what you actually grasp. You use complicated words because they feel powerful. You repeat ideas because they feel safe. You align yourself with popular explanations because they feel validated. But none of that requires real thinking. It's performance, not comprehension. And performance is easy. That's why it's so addictive. The moment you step away from performance, you feel exposed. You feel slow. You feel uncertain. That discomfort is the signal you've been avoiding. Because understanding doesn't come with applause, it comes with struggle. It comes with silence. It comes with long periods where nothing makes sense and you're forced to rebuild your thinking from the ground up. Most people never stay in that phase long enough. They escape at the first sign of difficulty. They replace curiosity with confidence, even when that confidence is fake. And over time, they build a fragile structure of knowledge that collapses the moment it's tested. Feynman's approach destroys that fragility. It replaces it with something far more durable, clarity earned through effort. That kind of clarity doesn't care how it looks. It doesn't need validation. It stands on its own because it has been tested, questioned, and rebuilt repeatedly. And once you experience that level of understanding, pretending no longer feels satisfying. It feels empty. If you can't explain something in plain language, you don't understand it. That statement sounds simple, but it cuts deeper than most people are willing to admit, because it removes every place you can hide. Technical terms, complex phrasing, memorized definitions, all of it becomes useless when you're forced to translate an idea into its simplest form. And that's where the truth reveals itself. You start to realize how much of what you know is actually just repetition. You've seen the words before, but you've never truly engaged with what they mean. You've followed explanations, but you've never broken them apart. You've accepted conclusions without understanding the path that leads to them. That's not learning, that's imitation. And imitation collapses under pressure. The moment you try to explain an idea clearly without relying on jargon, the gaps become obvious. You hesitate. You circle around the point. You fill the silence with unnecessary complexity. That's not a communication problem. That's a thinking problem. And it's one you can't fix by consuming more information. You fix it by confronting it directly, by forcing yourself to simplify again and again until the idea becomes so clear it feels almost obvious. That process is frustrating. It takes time. It exposes your weaknesses. But it also builds something real, something stable, something you can rely on. Because when you truly understand something, you don't need to dress it up. You don't need to impress anyone. You can strip it down to its core and still stand confidently behind it. That's the standard. Anything below it is just decoration. Your brain is trained to avoid effort. That's not a flaw, it's a survival mechanism. But in the modern world, it becomes a trap. Because the kind of effort your brain avoids is exactly the kind that leads to growth. Deep thinking requires sustained attention. It requires patience. It requires you to hold multiple ideas in your mind and examine how they connect. That's exhausting. So your brain looks for shortcuts. It settles for surface-level understanding. It rewards you for quick answers instead of accurate ones. And over time, you adapt to that pattern. You start to believe that learning should feel fast, that if something takes too long, it must be inefficient. But that belief is false, and it's costing you more than you realize. Because the most valuable insights don't come quickly. They emerge slowly, after repeated attempts, failed explanations, and constant refinement. When you avoid that process, you're not saving time. You're delaying progress. You're building a habit of shallow thinking that becomes harder to break with each passing day. You scroll through information instead of engaging with it. You consume without questioning. You move on before anything has a chance to settle. And then you wonder why everything feels unclear, why nothing sticks. The answer is simple. You never gave your mind the chance to work deeply. You trained it to escape instead. Reversing that pattern isn't easy. It requires discipline. It requires you to sit with confusion longer than you're comfortable with. It requires you to resist the urge to move on. But that's the price of real understanding, and it's a price most people refuse to pay. Confusion is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you've reached the edge of your current understanding. But instead of exploring that edge, most people retreat from it. They interpret confusion as a problem to eliminate rather than a signal to investigate. That's where they go wrong. Because confusion contains information. It points directly to what you don't yet grasp. It highlights the exact areas that need attention. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear, it just pushes it deeper, where it continues to weaken your understanding from the inside. Feynman approached confusion differently. He treated it as a starting point, not an obstacle. He broke it down piece by piece, refusing to move forward until every part made sense. That level of persistence is rare. It requires you to slow down when everything in you wants to speed up. It requires you to question assumptions you didn't even realize you were making. And it requires you to accept that progress is not always linear. Sometimes you have to go backward to move forward. You have to dismantle what you thought you knew and rebuild it from a stronger foundation. That process feels uncomfortable because it challenges your identity. It forces you to admit that your previous understanding was incomplete. But that admission is not weakness, it's strength. It's the foundation of growth. Because every time you confront confusion directly, you sharpen your thinking. You develop the ability to navigate complexity without being overwhelmed by it. And over time, what once felt difficult becomes manageable. Not because it changed, but because you did. You trust authority more than your own understanding. That's the second harsh truth most people avoid. You've been conditioned to believe that if someone sounds confident, they must be correct. If something is widely accepted, it must be true. If an expert explains it, your job is to accept it, not question it. That mindset creates dependence. It turns you into a passive receiver of information rather than an active thinker. And while it feels efficient, it comes at a cost. Because understanding cannot be outsourced. You can listen, read, and observe, but at some point you have to take ownership of the idea. You have to test it against your own reasoning. You have to see if it holds up when you examine it closely. Feynman didn't reject authority out of arrogance. He rejected blind acceptance out of necessity. Because he understood that truth doesn't depend on who states it. It depends on whether it can be explained, tested, and understood. That approach requires confidence, not in your knowledge, but in your willingness to question it. It requires you to challenge ideas even when they come from respected sources, not to prove them wrong, but to ensure you truly grasp them. That distinction matters, because questioning is not about rebellion, it's about clarity. And clarity is the only thing that gives your knowledge weight. Without it, you're just repeating what others have said. With it, you're thinking for yourself. And that difference changes everything. Stop collecting information. Start dismantling it. That's the shift that separates passive learners from active thinkers. Right now, you probably measure progress by how much you've consumed, how many videos you've watched, how many pages you've read, how many concepts you've encountered. But consumption is not comprehension. You can absorb large amounts of information and still remain confused, because without analysis, information remains disconnected. It doesn't form a coherent structure. It doesn't become usable. Dismantling changes that. It forces you to break ideas into smaller parts, to examine each component individually, to understand not just what something is, but why it works the way it does. That process creates connections. It turns isolated facts into a network of understanding, and once that network forms, learning accelerates. because new information has somewhere to attach. It integrates instead of floating on the surface. But dismantling requires effort. It's slower than consumption. It demands focus. And it often feels like you're making less progress, even when you're actually making more. That illusion is what causes most people to abandon it. They chase speed instead of depth. They prioritize quantity over quality. And in doing so, they limit their own potential. Because the goal is not to know more, it's to understand better. And better understanding comes from breaking things apart, not stacking them on top of each other. You're addicted to speed. That's the third harsh truth. You want quick results, fast answers, immediate clarity. You expect learning to fit into short bursts of attention, and when it doesn't, you assume something is wrong, either with the material or with yourself. But the problem isn't difficulty, it's expectation. You've been conditioned to believe that efficiency equals speed, that the faster you move, the more productive you are. But that logic fails when applied to deep thinking. Because understanding is not a race, it's a process. One that unfolds over time through repeated exposure, reflection, and refinement. When you rush that process, you skip essential steps. You move past confusion before resolving it. You accept partial explanations as complete, and you build a foundation that can't support more advanced ideas. Slowing down feels counterintuitive because it challenges your habits. It forces you to engage more deeply than you're used to. It removes the constant sense of progress that comes from rapid consumption. But in exchange, it gives you something far more valuable: clarity that lasts, clarity that you can build on, clarity that doesn't disappear the moment you stop reviewing. That's the difference between temporary knowledge and lasting understanding. And it's a difference you can't achieve by moving faster, only by going deeper. Stop trying to sound smart. Start trying to be clear. That's the shift that changes everything. Because clarity is not just a communication skill, it's a thinking skill. When you aim for clarity, you're forced to organize your thoughts, to identify what matters and what doesn't, to remove unnecessary complexity. That process strengthens your understanding. It makes your ideas more precise, more reliable, more useful. But clarity requires humility. It requires you to accept that you might not understand something as well as you thought. It requires you to be willing to simplify, even if it makes you feel less impressive. And that's where most people hesitate, because they've tied their identity to sounding knowledgeable. They equate complexity with intelligence. They fear that simplicity will make them appear less capable. But the opposite is true. Simplicity is a sign of mastery. It shows that you've gone beyond surface-level understanding, that you've engaged deeply enough to strip away everything unnecessary. And once you reach that level, your thinking becomes more effective. You make better decisions. You learn faster. You communicate more clearly. Not because you know more, but because you understand better. And that's what truly matters. Now, the challenge is simple but not easy. Pick one thing you believe you understand. Just one. Don't choose something trivial. Choose something that matters, something you've encountered repeatedly. Then break it down. Strip away the complexity. Explain it in the simplest possible terms. No jargon, no shortcuts, no hiding. And pay attention to where you struggle, because that's where the truth is. That's where your understanding breaks down. Stay there. Work through it. Refine your explanation until it becomes clear, until it feels almost obvious. That process will take time. It will test your patience. It will expose your weaknesses. But it will also give you something most people never achieve: genuine understanding. And once you experience that, you won't want to go back, because you'll see how much of your previous knowledge was built on assumptions. You'll recognize the patterns of shallow thinking, and you'll have the tools to break them. That's the real challenge. Not just to learn more, but to think better, to question deeper, to refuse easy answers. Because the truth is brutal. Your progress isn't limited by your ability. It's limited by your willingness to confront what you don't know and do the hard work required to truly understand it.